cannot talk, will have less tendency to talk about soccer. That's probably not true. They're probably still going to talk about soccer in the chat. Well, but they were talking about the affections. So there are affections associated with soccer. So I guess that counts.
I will feel affections of hate if it ends up being true that Sporting win through some spectacular goal, as Eric described. If that really turns out to be the case, then I'm definitely going to have doubled intensity of hatred. Okay, why? Because the thing that I love is experiencing sadness, but then also that I'm made to imagine that how does this work exactly? I don't know. It just makes me angry. Yeah.
Well, did you get a sense here? I mean, in a certain way, what he was saying to me made sense in a kind of topological kind of way. But did he say why we hated to begin with?
Yeah, so we hate we hate things that we imagine are going to diminish or restrain our essential power of acting, which is also our power of maintaining our existence. So it's it's kind of I think it's probably a little more complex than the equivalency that some people give it with a kind of simple, evolutionary survival instinct kind of thing. But I think that at least gives you a good way of kind of getting there eventually, is to think of it like that, and that, okay, yeah, things that threaten us, they're just naturally going to have affects of hatred, sadness. So it all really, it's about these two directions, which is, there's joy, which is what increases our power. Sadness decreases it.
But then initially you made, is there a proposition that literally says that which will hinder us, we will hate?
Yeah,
I think he does somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's towards the beginning of this part, in part 3. Let's see if I can maybe find it.
I mean, it seems to me on page 81 it was close. He who imagines that what he loves is destroyed will be saddened, but he who imagines it to be preserved will rejoice. He who imagines that what he hates is destroyed will rejoice. I mean, I understand that, but there seems to me there needs to be something before those propositions. Like, what is the original wellspring of hate or love?
So I think that would be, it's the fact that we have, okay, so the essence of a mode is its power of acting or power of existing to persevere in its existence.
Okay.
But then that is always determined by its affections in existence. So those affections either help increase it or either decrease it. And I think that is what determines our affective disposition towards those things that we think are involved through our imagination. So we're constantly kind of interacting with this complex world of external bodies and whatnot that affect us, but through the medium of our imagination, which is also in affection itself. So the way that we're just naturally kind of I think it's the fact that our essence is this kind of conatus, this striving to persevere in existence, and the fact that that is really the wellspring, I would say, of our affective disposition, and the way that it's geared towards things that increase it in a certain way and things that decrease it in another way. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I mean, I'm a little, I thought surely he would have said that in the definitions or postulates at the beginning, but he doesn't of part 3, because I've got that sense very strongly, like Chase said, that we love what we love. I'm not sure how to put it. What we love, what empowers. No, that's not even right. But something like that. We love what empowers us and hate what disempowers us, or something. But one confusion that I keep throwing in here, I think because of Nietzsche, is the way you put it, Chase, was it has to do with preservation of existence. But then there's that question: is it preservation or is it expansion? Is it preservation of existence or expansion of power? And for Nietzsche, it would be the second. But it sounds like, if I remember right from what you said last time, that Spinoza, it talks one way sometimes and another way another time, and it's never clear exactly which one he's emphasizing. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so. But what he does say, he does acknowledge that it's not a kind of simple. So what he does say is that, okay, yeah, the preservation of our existence works through, because we're composite bodies, and we're made of all these motions of rest or relations of motion and rest, speed and slowness. We constantly have to have this replenishment of our parts. We constantly need to try to increase our power through active affections in order to even maintain ourselves, really. So they're kind of implicated in each other, and at times he does seem to understand that.
So wait, so just before you leave that point, when I hear that, what it sounds like you're saying is that because of our composite nature, we're in a sense always losing power, and so we have to replenish it. Or is that true? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So what we are essentially, if you remember the part on bodies in the second part, where he's describing them as kind of inherently composite. So, and there's a relation, a proportion of motion and rest, speed and slowness that defines us. So that's always going to be what we're trying to maintain as our power. Because if we lose that proportion of motion and rest, we're no longer the same thing. If you think about it, we're a system, but it has this kind of resonance that makes it an integral, relatively unified thing. That's kind of what he seems to be saying, is that this through this shared motion, that's how we can form an individual, and we have to maintain that. So
is there a tendency then for the composite parts over time to begin to dissociate, so that we keep having to put energy into maintaining the composition?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Interesting. And the picture I might to make sense of that individual all moving at the same speed kind of a thing, what I picture in my mind is maybe because of read too much science fiction, but if you imagine like a cluster of asteroids, like a little cluster, if they're moving in space and they're not being affected by any other external forces, they will all continue to move together as a unit. So they're really just a collection of rocks, but these rocks they also have a mild, moderate, a small amount of gravitational attraction among them, but they also are all moving at the same speed. But if you go and, poke one, like you throw a rock at one of the others, it's going to begin to dissociate those things. And the more you do that, the more dissociation you're going to get. And eventually they're going to start going off in their own direction. So that's kind of the way I imagine that, he thinks all individuals are like that. They're these composites of things that have, like you say, this constant same, I don't know if you would say velocity, but the same form of motion about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then so our power of action is also a way of maintaining that relation. But that relation itself, it requires a certain sort of active, ability to maintain it. And why? That's because we're constantly also being subjected to passive affections, which make up most of what we experience.
And are those caused by external?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's like in my analogy, it's like we're always bombarded with things from the outside that will tend to shake up the unity of the system.
Yeah. So in a way we got that kind of the same motion and speed kind of going on, but also our power as well. They're kind of complementary in that at the same time, that ability to maintain that resonance with the parts or whatnot is also a way to kind of keep going in that relation, to fight off the passive affections that would just disturb it, and that's when you die, basically. So yeah. Death.
You fail to maintain coherence among your parts.
Yeah, so he has this interesting part. It's not until the part 4, I think towards the end, where he says that you can die while still being biologically alive by being at in a different state of motion and rest. And he gives so the example he gives is somebody who experienced some kind of amnesia and didn't remember anything that happened to them, some poet, and thought that the works that he wrote were not his. So he says basically, this is another person, this is another relation of motion and rest. So relative to what this person was before, that person is dead relative to that. But yeah, they've got a new motion and rest going on. But at the same time, biological death, we lose one kind of point of resonance, but then we just go to another one. And that can be taken up and used in, organic carbon, whatever, become bodies again. And yeah, so there's constantly these parts that are moving around and varying, what relation do I go into? And the affections are kind of those variations within it that can either help maintain it if they're active and joyful on the affect side, or they can diminish it, restrain it by possibly damaging its coherence. So yeah, there it is, Spinoza. Glad we got some more people going here. The spring break.
Yeah, I was sorry. I was late. Work just really helped me up today. But I wanted to see if maybe we could dive into like a couple specific claims Spinoza makes, like kind of in the weeds of his conception of affects, because some of them, I think it's mostly just a lack of understanding on my part, but some of them didn't quite seem to compute. So like one that comes to mind is P30, specifically when he's going into the demonstration, I'm pretty sure. That's page 86 on the Penguin. He's talking about the quote is, "He who imagines that he affects others with joy or sadness will thereby be affected with joy or sadness." A very classic, and Spinoza may reject this on its face, but the idea here is basically that if you believe to be the one who brings sadness onto other people, that will be like kind of reflected onto yourself almost. But I can imagine a scenario where someone who you really despise for whatever reason, or you believe who has wronged you or something to that effect, you causing sadness onto them could bring about a response of joy. I'm not saying that that would be a good thing to do, but if we're just talking about like mechanically, this is how the affects are supposed to work. What am I missing there that like there's no way to be the affect of sadness onto somebody else and you not be able to feel joy from that?
I mean, he does say that, right?
Yeah, I think he does. I don't know what proposition though.
I
Well,
think
he says,
talks a lot about like hating other people and causing them sadness, that this would actually bring you joy.
right here, he specifically is, well, so then maybe what I'm pointing at then is perhaps a perceived contradiction in Spinoza thing. Because if I'm reading him correctly, the idea that he's talking about here is that, where is it?
I guess like maybe the assumption would be, or our assumption would have to be to correct him, would be that these others are kind of neutral others. Which, I mean, I guess I was just holding that assumption because I feel like he does. I don't know if it's before or after, right? But I feel like he very explicitly talks about causing other people sadness in a way that would increase your joy.
Yeah, he just says, "He who has done something which he imagines affects others with joy will be affected with joy, together with a consciousness of himself as the cause, or he will regard himself with joy and the converse." So that to me seems to be saying, I mean, again, maybe it's just a rule that has an exception that he bakes in, but it seems like I'm trying to understand what's like, I don't know. I don't want to say the same thing I said prior, but it seems to me that he's kind of like putting out this universal statement and then making like a very particular exception for it that you could imagine interpreted into other ways as well. Like, I don't think you can just like, it wouldn't just be this example of hate giving you the opportunity to produce joy within yourself when you're putting sadness on affecting other people with sadness. I imagine we could come up with a lot of different scenarios where things like that are happening. So I don't know. Again, I'm just trying to like get into the nitty gritty mechanics of it.
So from what you just read, it seems like the difference that we were highlighting here is that I think the section you read follows the section on ambition. So the things that other people esteem generally, like if we want to, he doesn't say general will, but that was almost, what it seemed to indicate, like in terms of popular things that are esteemed popular, popularly in your culture. If you do them, or if you, work towards them or promote them, then you will feel good. You know what I mean? You feel joy from promoting the things that your culture promotes. And conversely, if you go for something that is shameful and you're seen doing it, or you see yourself doing it, you feel feelings of shame. But that's different from somebody one person you hate. If you cause them sadness, that will bring you joy. So it doesn't, I'm just trying to clarify. It didn't seem to, I don't see a conflict, I just see kind of different scope. With the section you were reading out was more about public perceptions, and the part Joey was talking about was specific, like one-to-one personal relations.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that could be the case. Yeah, I may have just like misinterpreted or read it wrong. Yeah. I guess that was just my big takeaway from this section is that, you know, I mean, this is my second time through it, so I'm just kind of like more so picking at it a little bit more than the last time. And another one was like P32. This, I think, here's a better way of framing my question with this whole section. Is this kind of like, are we looking at like a general rule for how humans on average engage with one another through their affections, or are we looking at a model that we could take any kind of situation and be able to like understand the underlying affects of everybody? Because it's just the idea of like essentially that everyone covets what someone else enjoys to the extent that if they can't have it, they want to remove it from the other person. I think we could think of instances where we've all felt that before, but I don't think we all universally feel that. Like, I can't paint. I've tried to learn. I just don't have the willpower or capacity, whatever you want to break it down to do good art. But I don't like want to take that away from my friend who does really good painting. So this is where I'm getting at. You know, maybe I'm just like overcomplicating all of this, but how much of this is general rules for how humanity thinks, and how much of it is like a real like scientific model of understanding the affects of every human mind?
I did kind of, I mean, just hearing you say that, because when I was reading it and the way he kind of will mention these very specific affects, like that's what this is, that's what this is. And I feel like there were cases where he was like, and we could kind of draw out other affects too. I feel like, you know, I use big and so on, or we could do this with a lot of other things, almost kind of giving the impression that it was almost this kind of like systematic, like explanation of everything, or just like of how our affects work. And, you know, I kind of like, it felt cool to read it in that manner, just like, oh yeah, it's like how everything plugs into the affects and relates to the different ones. I got that impression. I think your example of like the jealousy and the envy, right? I find myself wanting to, and with that one in particular, also wanting to push back, like, is it impossible for me to not feel jealousy? I guess, you know, there might be,
I think putting it as a
recognize-
universal is the problem. I think if we were to say people tend to, or, you know, there's like a trend line towards envy, I think it's like, okay, cool. You know, we all experience envy from time to time. There seems to be some kind of relation going on here, but the way he says it is almost like an absolute, if this, then this. And that's, I think, what I have more of a problem with, because it just doesn't seem to comport with like my lived experience.
What's not clear to me is whether he, I mean, which hadn't occurred to me until you brought this up. What's not clear to me is whether, to what degree is he giving an explanation of what we normally, you know, like, so when we use the word hate, you know, love or hate or jealousy or whatever, when we use this word, this is really what we mean. To what degree he's saying that, you know, which then the normative claims seem to be problematic. Or is he just stipulating, when I use this word, I mean this? And I think, if, you know, I'm pretending to be Spinoza here, you know, when I use this word, I am stipulating this definition. And I think we would all be a lot better off if we would use these precise definitions instead of these fuzzy, muddy definitions that tend to cloud our communication. I mean, that's another, seems to me maybe another possible reading is he's giving a clear and distinct, in a sense, vocabulary that reflect his preferences for communication. Now, I don't know, I haven't looked at the text to see which one of those interpretations is better supportive. At least it seems like that's a possible interpretation.
So there's something in Proposition 52 where he does talk about kind of language and the names for these affects, I guess. But I remember, so I read this really late at night, and this is where I was just like, what? I'm gonna go to sleep, because I didn't quite understand what he was saying. So he goes on to eventually talk about, you know, he names certain more of these affects, but there's something about naming things. Maybe I'm actually getting this is the wrong proposition. I don't know. Does anybody remember? There's something about.
I found it if you want me to read it.
Yeah,
I'll just
yeah,
type
go
it in
for it.
the
Yeah.
chat. It's yeah, it's Proposition 52. It's the second paragraph of the scholium, and it's the last sentence. And it says, so it is clear that the names of the affects are found more from the ordinary usage of words than from an accurate knowledge of the affects.
Okay.
I think that's what you're referring to. That was
Yeah.
kind of what popped in my mind.
Yeah,
when it
that's
was-
it. Yeah, so I think that would indicate that he thinks that the way that he's constructing these affects, so in the way he talks about it in the preface is that I'm going to treat the affects as if it's a question of bodies, planes, and lines. He's going to treat it like geometry. And guess what? You have to deal with that. So I think the way that he's doing that, he thinks that, yeah, this is a much more accurate way to do things than the way that the ordinary usage of words, that's what reflects the names of them. So it's kind of, he still has to use the words. He's not really, coining neologisms here, but I think, yeah, he thinks that his definitions are better and something distinct somewhat from the common usage, it seems like. Yeah, as far as, kind of like what exactly he thinks about, as like a universal model or whatnot. So he talks about human nature in here. And when he talks about that, sometimes he does put a quantifier on these things that is more probabilistic or like statistically distributive, in the sense that he's saying because this is part of human nature, most will tend to do this. So he does seem to say that, and he has obviously an understanding of these individual differences, which lead us to have different judgments based off our own individual affects and whatnot. But then I think on another level, he is still saying that this, he's trying to give like a metaphysical realism kind of to this, where he would want to say that, yeah, this is, what is going on, and it's not like a, maybe in the way that something like scientific models would be used, where it's like, yeah, this is just the model is different, the map's not the territory. So I think Spinoza, and maybe you can think of, maybe philosophy is kind of like this too, in the sense that philosophy, yeah, there always is some kind of distinction between, what we're trying to describe as reality and our descriptions or our concepts, but in a way we're kind of tending towards that as a limit always. We're trying to be adequate to reality completely, but whether we actually get there, probably not. Where science is something that you're like, okay, yeah, we're not necessarily trying to do that. We're just trying to get results more so. And these things are just models to get results, where philosophy is something that is trying to kind of grasp something, dare I say, absolute? I don't know. Yeah. Which doesn't mean that all this stuff is universal, but yeah.
I think it's pretty fair to say that he doesn't use common language like hate. Like if I came up to Spinoza and I was like, oh my God, I have this like affect of hate towards pineapple on pizza, he would be like, no, you don't. Like that doesn't make any sense with what I talk about, but there are some cases like the envy one, for example. I couldn't find like a real distinct difference between, maybe there is some like really tight nuance between how I would use someone being envious and he would describe like the affect of envy. So that was another really interesting one that jumped out to me. I guess they just I'm a little wary of in general of systems that try to essentially like predict human behavior on like a very systematic level of like, yes, if X then Y, because humans seem to be a little more fickle than that. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting though, what you were talking about.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I'm largely in agreement with you, Christian, but I also want to say that there's something, we don't deny the power of this kind of systematic knowledge that he's trying to lay out, because the person that comes to my mind is Edward Bernays. I feel like Edward Bernays, if he didn't read this section of Spinoza's Ethics, worked as if he'd read this section of Spinoza's Ethics. You know what I mean? Like these kinds of, you can use associations to kind of get people to like things, by relating it to something that ties to survival, something, starting with very base kind of material interest, but then introducing other things in a staged, calculated way. You can induce people to like or dislike certain things. You can manipulate the passions. And I feel like that's kind of what's going on here is Spinoza's inadvertently saying, if you want to manipulate somebody's passions, their inclinations, insofar as they're not behaving rationally, but not reflectively, but and you see my point, right? Insofar as people are manipulated through mass media, these are the mechanisms by which they can be manipulated.
And that's one of the reasons why I think Spinoza kind of has his cake and eats it too, where he is essentially like, he's kind of doing both of the things that Nevitt was talking about earlier, where he's like, this is what hate is, but this is also what I mean by hate. And whatever you're talking about is probably just nonsense. So he's kind of, because if you were to say like, oh, these are just my words for these terms, it kind of like robs what Spinoza's doing of some kind of power. Because it distances it from what is actually like most people feel like they have going on. But if you say like, yeah, I'm redefining these terms because I need to, but also what you're using is useless and nonsensical, which is essentially what he's saying, then yeah, I mean, I think that's totally his intention. Don't get me wrong, it's not like there's not good stuff here. Like I said, 99 times out of 100, I think his comment on envy is right. I'm just curious about the one time it wouldn't try.
I don't think you would say, that he's just completely arbitrarily making up. I mean, the way I was wondering if when he's stipulating his definitions, it's like, well, we use this word hate, and we use it in this really broad fashion that covers a whole lot of stuff. And I'm not completely defining. I'm not defining completely apart from that. But what I'm doing is I'm going to reduce the scope and delineate the boundaries and just say, this is what I mean by hate. And so like I think he's picking words that are still in the normal use, the normal vocabulary, but he's restricting their meaning to something that he can that he can fit into his geometric method. And maybe he would say, then when we use it in these more diverse, fuzzy ways, we're just not being philosophers. I don't know.
I feel like that's what I was trying to say. Yeah, basically the same thing. Yeah, I just use stronger language. Most of the guys I read would just call it nonsense, so that's what I went for. Maybe Spinoza wouldn't use that word; he'd be a little nicer.
I wanted to use an illustration with a little less of a negative valence to Eric's manipulation thing. When I was a Montessori teacher in a Montessori middle school for 4 years. And one of the things Montessori strives to do, and I think that I think in some ways they're deluding themselves, but they want to authentically engage students. And what that means is they want to find students' authentic interests and encourage them to engage in material that are an expression of what they're authentically interested in. Well, part of the dogma is that young children are authentically interested in everything, and that it is just an artifact of their socialization and terrible education that some of their interests get stomped out or distorted. But if you properly educated a child, that they would just go through into adolescence and adulthood with this, wanting to know everything there was to know about everything. And just as a side note, we had students in the middle school who had spent their entire lives in Montessori and did not have an authentic interest in everything. So either that's an incorrect thesis, or the Montessori schools they went to screwed up. But what would then happen is in the middle school, when the students are less compliant, because when they're in elementary, they're by and large pretty compliant. Most of them want to please the adults, right? But then you hit adolescence, and all of a sudden they're like, "Fuck the adults. I'm a completely independent person, and I don't, I'm not going to be manipulated anymore." So then the sort of pedagogical dogma shifts, and what you try to do is you try to find things that they are interested in, and then get these other things they don't want to learn in to ride on top of those topics. So, for example, Maria Montessori, the only thing she wrote about adolescence, she wrote very little. She wrote one book called From Adulthood to Adolescence, and her ideal educational environment for adolescence was a farm. And the idea was that when you engage these kids in farming, and she was assuming that they would all just love to do this. I'm not sure they would, but that was what she thought. But you teach them about numbers and about mathematics by selling produce. And so they're having to do accounting, and they're having to measure things, and they're having to buy seed and to buy and sell animals, and they learn chemistry because they're doing agriculture, and they're taking care of these animals and having to worry about fertilizer and all this kind of stuff. And so the idea was, there's these topics that these students claim they don't really like, and the way you get them to engage in these topics is by integrating those topics into something that they are authentically interested in. And that seems to be, to me, it still seems to be a kind of manipulation, but at least that's part of their dogma, is that you can, I don't know, sounds like use this sort of Spinozistic notion to, manipulate children into learning what you really want them to learn, whether they think they want to learn it or not.
I mean, if the mind is deterministic, ultimately, if everything is deterministic, and I don't see how there's a universe where you couldn't engineer somebody's attitudes or affects. I guess my only criticism of Spinoza is that it seems very simple, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It could be right, and I'm just holding this unnecessary skepticism against it. But most of the time when you talk about social engineering, it's like a multifaceted approach that requires a whole lot of different attack vectors, that you're coming at somebody's everything, basically their beliefs, their emotions, etc., yada yada, all the way through until you've got a hold of them, and then you can make the change that you wanted to make. Versus like if I put someone, like X therefore Y,
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, it sounds like it's very mechanistic, treating like people are just these kind of machines, and if you program them correctly, then you can figure out what they're going to do. That kind of has that kind of flavor to it, which raises a question. I've heard people in this seminar and other places really be concerned about essentialism in the human domain, where we assume that there is a human nature, and that you can figure out what people are going to do based on their human nature. I mean, to me, that's exactly what this is. It's he says, well, this is what human nature is. And by definition, human nature means a nature that all humans share. So all humans are like this. I mean, that's your complaint against the universality of it. All people are exactly like this at the core.
I guess I find myself a little resistant to, reducing Spinoza to that. I guess I'm thinking like he's talking about affects and emotions, and maybe I feel a little bit more sympathetic to the idea that like our emotions might have some similarities. Like I think zooming out and looking at our overall lives, I feel like, there's so many bodies that are interacting that make our emotions kind of complex. And, I feel like thinking about it from his perspective, it might be like almost this very zoomed in, as if a body was kind of simple and just had one unitary tract of what increases its power versus what is not. But I guess, and maybe I'm just kind of having a very sympathetic read by, wanting to believe that Spinoza, zooming out into the actual complexity of a human life becomes a lot more complicated. And it's not necessarily that maybe we could predict everything, but and I'm kind of also thinking like, where is he trying to lead us? And I'm kind of thinking of the passage. So right now I'm looking at the bottom of 94 into 95, where he's talking about the affect of love and hate being diminished if we understand its cause to be kind of spread out across multiple causes. And I almost felt like that was almost like his widget end to saying like, how do we kind of like disinvest the intensity of a passion, or how do we kind of like diffuse a passion by understanding all these causes that go into it? And to me, that almost felt like almost this move in the direction of not even necessarily understanding all the causes, but understanding that there are more than just one cause, which would diminish my like hate and love over something. And I guess therefore like diminish my, and I guess maybe I'm wondering too, like would Spinoza say that of like this almost what I'm reading as like a goal to not be so passionately reactive to the world, but rather have this kind of, less hate, less love, even it feels like. But I guess I'm saying that I don't know if it's about understanding for him, but having almost just an understanding of it's not all attributable to that, and I shouldn't hate and love that with such intensity, but kind of just have more of a take a stance back. And I guess I kind of read that as like that kind of like stoic ethos that I feel myself being pushed towards when I'm reading this of like, oh yeah, like my partner is not the only cause of my unhappiness. I shouldn't hate her so much / love her so much. And it doesn't necessarily feel like I know what's going to happen, but I'm less likely to blame her or praise her as much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there is some the kind of ethical perspective that kind of goes into the stoicism thing. I think that's more the perspective that he's kind of giving here, in the sense that what is he ultimately, what is going on is, if this is a kind of a manual for anything, it's for kind of transforming our own affects, moving in this direction from sadness to joy. But even that is I think needs to be qualified. But yeah, I think that kind of perspective of, so I think he does want to, he's okay with lots of joy and love, except the right kind, where so that diminishment of affects, though, I think is interesting, because there's a certain aspect where I think he does want us to, I guess he wants us to, I don't know what his intentions are exactly, but so where he talks in Proposition 51, towards the very, very end, right above Proposition 52. So that's where he's talking about, these intensities kind of not in the technical term of intensities, but just as like all these are really strong affects, and he says, yeah, that we can diminish them by understanding them. And why is that? It's because so he says that part of it is that with the intensity of an affect where it's accompanied by you as the cause of it, as the internal cause, or you're the cause of, you imagine yourself as the cause of affects for other people, that this will be enhanced if you believe in freedom, as he says, as most people do, because men believe themselves free. Yeah, these affects are very violent. So I think that's one of the cases where he's going to say, yeah, understanding these things can help and can change the affect in this sense, but we still always have to be kind of maneuvering our way through these. There's not some kind of like a completely detached perspective, kind of just like looking down on this, using it to control people or whatnot. Is even that, what is the affective relation of that? Like if you're trying to control people in this very kind of crude way, is that joyful? Is that ultimately an active way of going about things? I think he would probably say no. That if our joy is kind of caught up in having just some kind of influence on other people or controlling people or whatnot, I think that's it's a bad setup. And yeah, I think that would go against also what he gets into as, what's in a good society, in the next part. He's going to talk about that, which is, so it's kind of it's because, so a lot of this, it reminds me of Nietzsche in the way that he talks about power as this kind of thing that is on one level kind of amoral, but on another level it's kind of, this is our origin of what we think of as virtuous, what we think of as good or evil, but in itself is kind of in this neutral area. But he's kind of giving this kind of sort of a descriptive kind of way of talking about it, but at the same time I think there is this kind of way of, this is how you can do things, where we can do something that corresponds with an increase in what people think of as virtue or good or bad or whatnot. So yeah, I don't know.
So that section you pointed out, Chase, the bottom of 51, right before you get to 52, when he finishes with, because men believe themselves free, these affects are very violent. It's kind of touching on what Joey was kind of mentioning. It seems that the more you understand that the causes are many and that you are not actually free, you're determined, the less violent your passions will be, right? So, I just want to say though, does this lead to, if we push it, if we understand ourselves not to be free at all, to be fully determined, then we should never be repentant, and we should never feel shame.
Yes, I think you're right. And I think that is one of the awesome things about Spinoza, is he is saying basically, no, screw sadness and all the things that kind of spawn from that. I think he is saying that, not necessarily that they're, oh my God, you should be, obviously you can't be, morally blamed for doing something, that's not in your free will. But yeah, so I think
somebody tells Dylan Roof, you ought to be ashamed. And Dylan Roof says, I do feel ashamed. Spinoza will wade in and say, no. You shouldn't feel ashamed, and you shouldn't tell him to feel ashamed.
Wait, who is that?
Dylan Roof was the guy who shot a black church, or Nicholas Cruz, the guy who went into the high school and shot 17 people.
Yeah, the young man who shut up the historic black church was named Dylan. I think you're right about his last name too.
Yeah, I'm just, are we willing to
Well,
extend this to everybody?
maybe I'm
Go ahead.
recalling, I don't think we've gotten there, but I know y'all have said this for those of you who have read more of the text about that Spinoza, when he's talking about the society, that he kind of just says things like, oh, yep, there's some people that we have to lock up. And it's almost like the idea of like, let's lock them up. They don't need to feel shame. They almost like they can't feel shame, or maybe they shouldn't feel shame, but we have to lock them up, question mark. And that's that. I don't know.
If it's all deterministic, you're just going to bring negative affects upon yourself by projecting them as the cause of their own actions, right? Like there's this like inherent evil that must be like crushed or something like that. When really, I mean, I'm not saying you should think this way, just making the case for Spinoza, I guess, where it's like, what good comes from you, like having this ultra moralistic position on them when they're the products of things that happened millions, if not billions of years before them. And just put them in a cage and be done with it,
I'm recalling.
Yeah, I could argue from a fully deterministic framework that it's very good for society to pick out people and point the finger of shame, even if
why? They were always going to do it.
Well,
why change
I
anything? Whatever will happen was always going to happen. This conversation,
what Spinoza says earlier, when something is publicly esteemed, then we learn to feel joy in pursuing or achieving that which is publicly esteemed. So, in many respects, the way we behave is informed by the opinions of others or how we perceive others to perceive us in return. And so even if we're fully determined, it could be useful to point the finger of shame at somebody like Dylan Roof.
Right, but if it was going to be useful, it was already decided to be useful far long ago. So what's the point of worrying about it?
Yeah, I mean, is he saying that we learn, or is he just saying this is what happens? If you observe, this is what happens. So that you see this play out in society, not necessarily that we need to encourage these sorts of feelings because people will learn something, but this is just the way people are. They will love these things, they will hate those things, they will do this, they will do that, and that's just the way it works out. And that's, so I don't see him setting out a program for, how you would teach people to do better, as much as just saying this is what happens. If you observe the world, this is how it works.
Yeah, I think what he's doing is he's trying to get us to understand these things first and foremost, and then saying, then with that understanding, then you can use that in a good way. But guess what? That's based off still at the same time your own affects. So, yeah. But I think there's one thing that, so here he's talking about a very, usually, at least the way I see it, is a kind of a very individual kind of, this is a human body, kind of level.
Are y'all hearing Chase?
I think you disconnected. I think you lost internet.
I guess real quick, I put in the chat, I'm thinking like shame versus guilt. And, I work with a bunch of mental health counselor people, and they kind of bring this up a bit. And I'm wondering, like, does this plug into the conversation? Because I typically hear like shame is something that we don't want to encourage, which involves kind of like attributing this to just like your nature, yourself, which I'm imagining I'm just like, my free will did this, like I am this way. Versus like you'll hear them say like guilt is more so, this is kind of like a behavior I engaged in. And typically you'll hear something like guilt pointed out as like a positive thing because it shows that their perceptions are like in alignment with, you might in Spinoza's case, like a different set of speeds and rhythms now. And so the guilt is this kind of like recognition that their old behaviors don't currently serve like their power, or serve the kind of active connections for them at this point. And I mean, I don't know, like maybe that question about does Spinoza want us to learn and change, or is he just pointing things out for the sake of kind of like acceptance? I'm resistant. Yeah, it's like my bias, I think, is that I'm resistant to the idea that we can't change by doing anything. And that I don't
It's
know.
not that you can't change, it's that you are always going to change. Right? Like I saw I should have put a link to it in the Discord. I forgot to. But this weekend I was reading something that was funny, and it was like the conundrum of Spinoza writing the ethics. And it's like, well, Spinoza couldn't have written the ethics to make the world a better place, because the world was always going to be the way it was always going to be, because he's a determinist. So who cares if he writes the ethics? It was always going to be how it winds up. But then he was always going to write the ethics. So why should he care about writing the ethics? Because he's always going to write it, because we know the past now. It was determined that he was going to write the ethics. So you like find yourself in this big, it like pulls whatever like meaning we could place onto anyone literally doing anything. It pulls all of that just directly out of it. Like you are the everything you will ever do, experience, and be a part of is like the product of stardust. And that's not to say you're special or a star, but that like it was caused by it completely. Well, it would be God in Spinoza's case, but you know, in a more secular deterministic view, you know, it'd be like rocks banging against each other billions of years ago led to the mass shooting in a school. You know, it's like, well, here we are. You know, we just have to deal with the now. I'm not saying that's good. I'm just kind of, that's how I mean, I think Spinoza is very much like you have to make peace with this, especially when we go into the ethics part of this. But not only is probably this section on the affects like the most important buy-in for the rest of the book. His section on ethics is going to be a lot of like ideas that you've probably heard of in stuff like what do they call it? Mental God, not it's like they talk about it with the meditation where you're aware of like your thoughts and that you are in control of your thoughts and all these mindfulness. I see a lot of Spinoza in modern mindfulness, as much as I'm not really a huge fan of a lot of that stuff, where there's this like big idea that like, oh, I was always going to be angry at this because of deterministic reactions, so why should I be angry at this? And it kind of diffuses it. Yeah, I mean, that is a lot of what I'm getting from Spinoza and that's one of the reasons almost why I think he does present these ideas of the affects in such an X therefore Y way, is because he's trying to sell it to you. Whether or not I think he's right, I think one of his goals is to try to sell it to you like, this is what happens, accept it. It is. And if you want to like debate him on it, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to take the debate with you. But until, you know, you prove him otherwise, X therefore Y, deal with it, you know?
Yeah, so I mean, he's arguing against free will. He's saying that our conscious decisions don't cause, you know, our bodily actions and whatnot. And then this is kind of his explanation of, well, then you'd be like, well, what does cause this, Spinoza? Come on, explain. And he's like, okay, these things cause it. You know, this is his explanation of, this is what actually happens. You know, we're determined by external forces, blah blah blah. But yeah, I still think there's something, you know, he still has an idea of freedom, even it's definitely not a typical free will kind of thing. And yeah, that's where, but yeah, the kind of stoic ethic thing, I think is I think he deviates from them in some ways. That is, yeah, I guess we'll get there. But at least one, okay, so I don't know why my internet cut off, but it did. It was determined. I don't know. But
yeah, it was always going to cut off.
Nevin, in response to your question, so if we are determined, well, I prefer active affects over passive affects. So that's what we are essentially. If we're as a conatus, as a striving to persevere in existence, that means basically prefer active affects, because that's the tendency to, yeah, that's what keeps you alive, basically. So I think he's saying that that is what we're determined to do.
So prefer is not really, because prefer implies some sort of choice. I mean,
Yeah,
so
there's definitely no choice, zero choice in it. No, it's
so,
yeah.
so we are our active affects, and then the passive stuff tends to impede that.
So I think, okay, so what we are is this conatus, this striving to persevere in existence, but what determines that are the affections that we undergo. Those affections that we undergo determine kind of what our conatus will actually strive to do, because if it has a bunch of imaginary ideas in it, and it thinks that by hating our neighbor down the block because he has a cool Jeep or something, and it's like my Jeep, but how do I compare it with mine? I must hate it or something. Yeah, if I have ideas like this, that can explain, why I'm have some kind of affective hate. But yeah, he's saying that this is what actually determines us to do what we're doing, but at the same time we're doing that because we're still striving to persevere in our existence. We're still trying to make that we're still acting in a way to try to increase our power. And but a lot of people are misguided about exactly how do we actually do that. A lot of
But
people,
when you say how do we actually do that, that implies doing something, which seems to imply choice.
so
And you
doing
say like
doing
shouldn't
something for, in this case, wouldn't be a choice. Instead, it would be, okay, now I'm determined by affects where I'm the cause of them, instead of something external that is the cause of me. So if I can determine myself, that is freedom, and that is also active affection. So that's what we would naturally, I think, have a tendency towards as an actual, if we understood all this affect stuff and the way I think he wants us to understand it, then I would say, okay, so the thing to do is to actually have active affects, because that's what we're kind of trying to do anyways, except when we're exercised by passive affects, we just do it in a shitty way, because we're chasing after these kind of imaginary goals of what we think will increase our power when it really doesn't. And
But to Christian's point, all that kind of language sounds like you're doing something. Like I am choosing to activate my active affects and choosing to try to avoid passive affects. I mean, like you were using the words like what we do and things of that sort. And
yes, you're
I mean,
definitely
on
doing
his view, we're not doing anything.
Yeah, but it's just that the choice isn't what causes you to do them. You don't choose and then start doing that. You're already doing it. But he's saying if you understand it, then you comprehend it. That is a way of determining yourself in the same way. So you can have something like a choice that's like corresponding with it, but the choice isn't doing anything. That's like a side effect of it. So yeah, I can read this book and basically like, okay, I get it. I figured out, what is some ways of that I can be better about my affects in that corresponds with my nature. And from that, my behavior will change based off my understanding. But that's because, there's still completely a line of determinism all the way through that. There's nowhere where the the determinism, the action is coming through my choice to do that. I'm like, at this point, okay, now I choose to believe this. Instead, it's all that is still direct, determined on this affect level. But he's saying, yeah, if we understand it, that in itself determines us in this way where we can have active affects.
So
That-
would it be correct then to say that for Spinoza, freedom is exactly just understanding why I do what I do?
Yeah, maybe not exactly, but I think it's definitely that is a big part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
So freedom is understanding as much as I can anyway, what is happening in the world, why I do what I do, why other people do what they do, why things are happening the way they are. That freedom is understanding as much as possible this sort of deterministic system
Yeah.
of
Yeah. I think so.
causes.
Yeah, is even something where we have such a natural tendency to think in ways that are counter to what Spinoza is talking about, where we think that we make choices through free will and whatnot. But instead, to really kind of go about and do these things, you kind of have to kind of go through that anyways, as it looks as if you're doing it through making choices, when really this is just another way of kind of possibly being able to understand things and have an active affection, so that in a way you're kind of using these things. See, I can't help but fall into this language of saying like, I'm doing this, blah blah blah, subject predicate kind of language, but there's a way of definitely of like an auto affection, a kind of self-determining, and that's what he thinks is freedom, and that's also what active affects are. So I think that is what he's trying to get us to. He's trying to affect us. He's trying to determine us to do that. But that probably puts too much emphasis on like this kind of like personal intention of his, where I don't think that's necessarily the case. But yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I have a lot to say on this idea, but I think it'd probably be best to save it for when we actually get to the section where it's a little more relevant as far as the ethical implications of why this needs to be the case. But spoiler alert, I don't buy Spinoza's framing of it, but
it actually kind of makes sense to me in that the closest you can get to freedom is having real clarity on what's, so if you think about like God is a self-determining being. And so for God to will and God to act there's not a difference, right? Because God is omnipotent. Whenever God acts, God wills. And that is freedom. God is free because there are there's no opposition there. Whatever God wills happens. In my case, if I am a confluence of forces, if I am a confluence of cosmic forces, then if I have an understanding of, I don't think this is, I suspect he would say this is not possible, but if I somehow had an exhaustive knowledge of the confluence of forces that constitute my being, then I would be like God in the sense that I would understand exactly what I'm doing, and in a sense, my action and will would be one, because my will is like the vector sum of all these active affects. And so, my doing and my knowing of what I'm doing are identical as they are in the case of God. If I could somehow exhaustively know, which I don't think I can, all those all those forces that constitute my being. I mean, I think the problem is he explicitly says somewhere in something we've already read, the reason we think we're free is because we're not aware of all those causes. We can't be aware of all these forces that constitute our beings. But the more I know, the more free I am, because the more I am aware that my will is the will. I'm not even sure how much that's a proper word, but my will is just the sum total of these forces. And the more I know that, the more free I am, because I understand this is what it is to be me, something like that. Is that in the general vicinity?
I think that's generally pretty good. Yeah. And that he's definitely trying to get us to, he has that kind of idea of, if by understanding, that's your power to comprehend. And that corresponds with your power of action to come into your own, to be able to self-determine yourself also by having an understanding of these things.
I wonder if
so the other thing is, so he's saying that, what is our essence? Our essence is, a part of God's power. So when we're really kind of fully, at the going towards the limit of our power by trying to, get these active affects, which everyone is doing, everyone's trying to get there. But depending on what affections are actually determining you, you may not be doing that. But if you're good at doing that, for whatever reason, maybe if you can read the ethics enough, just enough, maybe you can get there. And then you can get some active affects. And then, what happens then at that point? Well, then your essence is participating in the power, not only of itself as an essence, but as part of God's essence, because it's a part of God's power. What is God? It's this infinite way of thinking and understanding all things, infinite power of thought, and an infinite power of existence or action. So when we're acting, when we're comprehending things, that at the same time is also participating in the divine understanding or the divine action or whatnot. So yeah, I think that is kind of key to what he's trying to get at here, but also ties in with, how he sees this stuff fitting together with this kind of, metaphysical thing with God. And, I think that's helpful though, to see it from that perspective, that he's not just like saying these things randomly or whatnot, that this is kind of like a overall vision that he has.
So I'm probably going to make Eric angry here, but it seems to me there's something that this is not that far from a Kantian view in this sense. I get those. So, again, Eric will correct me if what I say about Kant is wrong, but it seems to me that for Kant, there's basically two motives, in inclinations and duty. And duty is a motive born out of reason. And so you basically have two choices. I can choose to act heteronomously and act according to what my affects determine me to do, or my will can be determined by that, or my will can be determined by reason. But in either way, it's determined. And so, the perfect moral agent, I think, for Kant is someone who would always do what is rational. And it seems to me rationality is ultimately deterministic for Kant. And so a perfect moral agent would be acting perfectly, rationally, and would therefore necessarily be just doing whatever it is that reason determines that person to do. And so I don't see that there's any sort of radical freedom for Kant either, because you're either going to be responding to your inclinations, or you're going to be doing what reason would have you do. And if you act out of reason, it is the rational essence of your being, just being rational and playing out the necessary dynamics of what reason demands of you. Is that not correct, Eric?
No, so I would say like part of what's making Spinoza difficult for me to digest is some of the Kantian precepts that I already carry into this, right? So so I find that a little surprising, but the way you backed it up, I want to say there's something to that, right? I think what you were the way you set it up, it's disabusing us of the notion of freedom with arbitrariness, right? Like if you're free, then you could just do anything, and your choices are more or less arbitrary, and Kant doesn't believe in kind of freedom at all, right? Either you are determined autonomously, which is your own, according to your own reason, which ends up being the same reason for everybody. And so if you follow the moral law, if you behave according to duty, it will not be arbitrary, right? And this is the freedom that Kant allows. So I would say that there's that, but from what I'm reading in Spinoza, he's not giving any special power to reason or consciousness as such. He's more or less saying we don't have the kind of freedom that Kant will later tell us that we do have, that it's all appetite and inclination. We are fully heteronymous in the way that Kant describes heteronomy. It seems that Spinoza is insistent that we are heteronymous in this way, and the way that Kant holds out autonomy is not possible, because he wants to say from the outset we aren't free. We don't have a free will. We don't actually make choices. That is and then men think so because they're given to some kind of illusion, right? And then that my Kantian comes out and says, yes, that's one side of the transcendental illusion on either one transcendental illusion on one side of the transcendental dialectic, right? Either holding out theoretically, speculatively, we are free. We have free will to determine ourselves, or that we don't. We are fully determined according to efficient causes. Both sides of these are a side of our transcendental illusions that stem from his general approach, which Kant would call Spinoza a transcendental realist, and Chase has said it a couple of times as well. Like he's very much committed to a kind of realism here, what Kant would call a transcendental realism, which gives him the latitude to make these pronouncements on God, will, and the ultimate nature of things. Again, being dipped in Kant, I have to so much of his heavy planks that are this part of his structure, I just reject outright. So it's a little hard. It's a little hard for me to entertain or follow as faithfully. Does it make sense?
I think Nietzsche. Your characterization seems right to me, and I think Nietzsche would go. Maybe that's one reason why Nietzsche had some sympathy with Spinoza, because I think Nietzsche would also agree that reason is instrumental. In other words, we do things because they're grounded in our affects, and then we justify them after the fact by reason. And I'm wondering, I don't know, maybe Chase does. I'm wondering if Spinoza would say something similar to that. Like you said, that there is no rational power of acting as such, like Kant would say that like I can choose to do what reason demands. And I'm thinking, maybe Spinoza would say, no, you're just going to do whatever your affects demand, and then you're going to justify it after the fact, which is what Nietzsche would say.
Yeah, I'm seeing that. I was thinking Hume when I was reading this section as well. Reason only ever is a slave to the passions, right? That's all it ever is and ever should be, a slave to them. And that's kind of what I'm getting out of Spinoza here as well. But Kant was very much moved against Hume on that front, right? Reason can surpass the passions.
Yeah, so the way I don't have a great understanding of how reason exactly works in Spinoza is, that's going to be the fourth part. But the way I kind of at least understand it from reading commentary on it is that reason helps kind of select those certain affects and whatnot to help organize them. So, okay, if we understand that things are, it's the product of the affections that happen to people. But, if I set up this environment where people are just getting a bunch of, passive affections, they're not doing anything themselves in this way that he's talking about, then that's not a very good, environment for that. So reason is something that will help select and organize the environment to make it where you can have those active affections more so. So yeah, he definitely has a lot more faith in something that he calls reason, or at least we call it reason in English, then Nietzsche is definitely more skeptical of reason. And I'd say, I think, sorry, Kant, but, and Spinoza too, but I think I may have to side with Nietzsche on that, but I'll try to ignore that and listen and see what Spinoza's case for reason is, because I mean, it seems like he's making a pretty particular, unique way of thinking of reason, it seems like. So one thing though, I wanted to, so the description of Kant, I think it is useful, although I think, let me try to explain the way that I at least understand Kant, and where I would see that how Kant and Spinoza differs, and then Eric, or if you can tell me if I'm way off base or not. Okay, so Kant is saying that, yeah, we have these kind of empirical inclinations and desires and whatnot, but morality would be something that can kind of go beyond that in some aspect. It's not determined by anything empirical. It's just a pure form of, practical reason, the categorical imperative thing. So we need to do that, and part of that requires a presupposition that we are free to do so, because you can't have freedom with some kind of deterministic thing. And so the way he explains that is that, yeah, all this stuff in critique of pure reason, it's about theoretical speculative knowledge. So from that perspective, we're empirically determined, but outside of empirical determinations in the transcendental, supersensory, that's where freedom is, and that's where morality also is. So from the interest of practical reason, as opposed to the interest of speculative, well, I guess it's not, is it some kind of reason?
He sometimes uses the word speculative to describe the type of reason in the first critique. Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah. So from that perspective, yeah, I could be determined or whatnot, but morality is doing something quite distinct from that, and that it's doing something that's counter to our inclinations and counter to the way that we're determined. So that's kind of my version of Kant there. But so I think what Spinoza is doing instead is he's saying, yeah, there is something like a way to maneuver within our inclinations and determinism and whatnot, but we do it not so much by, a kind of supersensory, transcendental morality kind of thing, but instead by transforming our own inclinations, which that would be, that's kind of like our conatus or whatnot.
But yeah, Kant has that later, first after you establish what the moral law is, right, and you recognize it through reason, then you can train yourself, like through habituation, to learn to love the things you're supposed to love, that morality tells you you're supposed to love. You can start to change your appetites through practices. But it's reason itself which presents the fulcrum for change, for the possibility of willfully changing yourself and your activity.
But can't we do that? I mean, there might be a person who has an inclination to be an alcoholic, but they choose that they're going to choose not to do things.
So I want to say on a Kantian picture, it's a reason that allows us to choose to join a 12-step program. I want to say on a Spinozan picture, it's not reason, maybe it's reason, but maybe it's another affectation or another, it's the overwhelming sense of like, oh, I've let my family down by spending the rent money on another bottle and I really can't do this anymore. I'm afraid they're going to leave me. I'm afraid my wife and kids are going to leave me. So I join a 12-step program, not because it's the rational thing to do, but because certain passions are outweighed by other passions.
Why can't it be both? Why does it have to be one? Why can't reason and affectation at certain times reinforce each other?
But it just, the argument.
Yeah.
What?
The argument here is like, what is human nature? What is reason? And what are the passions and how do they work? And I think that's where our disagreement is. So, like Nietzsche, I think would give an explanation like what I don't know about Spinoza, but Nietzsche would give an explanation like Eric did. And if you say why, I think Nietzsche would say, because there is no such thing as the will. And so, if you say, well, why can't they be working together? Because I don't think for Nietzsche, there is a rational will. There are just these forces that drive us around. And then what we do is we do something like what Eric described. And then we, after the fact, construct this argument, this rationalization that says, well, actually, what happened was I realized it was the reasonable and rational thing to do. But that is a after the fact reconstruction, when what I think what Nietzsche would say what really happened is more like what Eric said. There were these passions and drives and social pressures and feelings that actually motivated that action. There is no rational will as such. I'm not saying that's what Spinoza would say, but I think that's what Nietzsche would say.
Well, I haven't read Nietzsche in years, so I don't want to. I can't say anything about that, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted this group to read something of Nietzsche. So my selfish affectation, wanting to learn more about this philosopher. But if you don't mind me saying this, but can't I rationally say I don't want to be covered in body lice and to be very cold because I'm a homeless person, and there's certain things that if I did certain things, I could lose my house, I could lose my job, I could be wearing clothes that are falling apart, just be very, get pneumonia, whatever. I mean, a person can see trajectories of consequences of action.
Yeah, but what Nietzsche would say is that what's motivating those changes it's not like pure reasoning. It's not like a person is sitting there and thinking, now what would be the rational thing to do here, and what would be rationally appropriate. Instead, this person has these feelings of disgust at the lice, these feelings of dissatisfaction at not having food regularly and not having a place to live, and then you can use. So maybe I think Nietzsche would say there is no will that is independent of the affections, but he doesn't deny that there's reason. But I think he thinks reason is instrumental. And so what happens is that person then uses reason to to reach those goals that his affects have set out for him.
Reason is at the service of.
Exactly.
Okay.
Whereas someone like Kant is going to say reason is an independent faculty that can act independently of those affects and so on.
Yeah. So Weber, following Weber, Horkheimer and Adorno talk a lot about the divorce between objective reason and instrumental reason. Kant is still holding on to some notion of objective reason.
which is maybe one reason we should read the Dialectic of Enlightenment.
Yeah, perhaps. So I think so once again, I don't totally know. You know, we're getting into the part of in section 4. I've only read part of it, but I think Spinoza is going to have something like a kind of like a moderate view that's kind of in between all these ideas. I think he would probably side with Kant in thinking that there's kind of an objective reason on some level, but he would also probably think that works within affect at the same time. So yeah, it's kind of, I think you'd say, okay, so I'm speculating at this point. This is what I'm guessing that Spinoza would say, but I don't really know.
That's
but it'd be
a
something
great
like,
teaser, though.
say
I
what?
said that's a great teaser.
Yeah. So I think what he would want to say is something like, okay, yeah, we can use reason would be something like using okay, we're working with affect either way, but then reason is a kind of affect that understands kind of what is actually going on in terms of what is affecting me and what it is actually doing in terms of my power. So if I can understand an affection that causes sadness as indeed causing sadness, and understand it in terms of that kind of complex relation and why it works that way, that would be kind of that's kind of like the objective side of reason, would be understanding, the kind of total causes, not total, but enough of an adequate idea of the causes so I could understand the affection, then that he thinks can kind of diminish some of the bad, diminish some of the diminishing aspects of it, and also kind of lead us in another direction away from those kind of affections. And I think that's kind of the idea of reason. But it sounds like it's a very kind of social or collective thing. So it's almost like, like that alcohol 12-step program or whatever. So I think you would say that reason would be something like, let's make 12-step programs so that we can help people who have, these natural affections to do this, so that we can change them in some way. And now that kind of sounds maybe like the Edward Bernays kind of thing, but either way, I think that's what reason would do in terms of kind of like organizing scenarios or environments for good affects, that they would do something like that. Like, yeah, let's have good programs so that people don't, they're not just kind of like randomly like, oh no, I have a disposition towards alcoholism. There's nothing at all I could possibly do. So it's kind of like, let's understand what alcoholism is, how that relation happens, so that we can work to try to, in some way, temper it where we can, or at least understand in a way where, we can work with it rather than just being like, oh, whatever, it's all random, so whatever. So yeah, that's my kind of my speculative take on reason.
So it sounds like it
Accurate.
has,
I don't know.
it sounds like it, if you're right, that it kind of has a supervisory function where reason is able to understand things, whereas the affects don't understand things, they just want. So reason has this ability to kind of understand what's going on. And then maybe there's some agency there too, in terms of, like you said, like reason, maybe reason doesn't have its own agency, but it has a kind of pseudo agency in arranging things so that certain affects can be privileged and others not.
Yeah, I think it's something kind of like that. Although I think you would still want to say that that so affects are indeed kind of inclinations towards a certain thing, but but the idea is that if reason kind of has its way with the affects, then those affects with themselves want that reason, which is kind of like it is supposed to be a kind of loop at that point. It's a positive feedback loop where you got reason organizing stuff, so you get more active affections, so you get more reason, so you get more active affections. And yeah, I think that's what he's trying to do. And the way that the affects work through this imitation also, I think, kind of suggests that sort of cybernetic sort of view of feedback loops operating. Of course, that's adding something that is, well, Spinoza didn't know about cybernetics exactly, but I think he's getting there somewhat. Hey, cybernetics, that's what the science of control, right? So perhaps, yeah.
I really feel like Spinoza doesn't make a super clean delineation between reason and the affects on purpose, because they're not like these very distinct concepts. Like I put in the chat, like it seems to me like they're more two sides of the same coin than they are distinct coins, where one's like one coin is heads and the other's tails, top and bottom, something like that, or even supervisory to the other, because there's like an implication in here that like, what does it mean if we're going to say in this metaphysical world that Spinoza's constructed for us that affects, let's just say bare affects on their own, and reason and affects are these like different things, but you have just like bare passions or affects on their own, that they are unreasonable? Like, what are we trying to say there? That they're like without cause, without motivation, that they don't have any underlying reason to them, or that they're not intentional? Nothing. I mean, like, it doesn't matter how you try to slice up reason, because again, Spinoza's before Kant, so we can't even really guarantee that he's working with reason as we're kind of like projecting from these other authors. It seems to me that like any way you try to slice up reason apart from the affects, you're deviating from like the metaphysical structure that he's put up in some kind of way, if that makes any sort of sense.
Yeah, I think that's
I
right.
mean, it looks like you.
Yeah, I don't think there's a very like clear cut. I think that's intentional, is that this is something imminent, where he's not going to say that reason is something that is metaphysically distinct in a very especially in a way where it's kind of above or transcendent of affects. And so some of the more the kind of like Deleuzian secondary sources that I read, they make the point that reason has this kind of embodied kind of function to it, which I don't want to judge exactly until until I've read the part in Spinoza that I think is relevant, because I think some of the Deleuzian commenters on Spinoza are kind of exaggerating aspects that goes along with like their thesis somewhat, where they'll say something like it's bodies or something, because it goes along with their point they're trying to make. But maybe I'm being unsympathetic, but yeah, either way.
I think. Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I just want to something very. I don't know what word to use, because it seems like you start using the word and then it gets into categories. But but like, to me, to say something is not rational doesn't mean it's crazy. It just means that it's determined by something other than reason. So if Christian, like, what's your do you like ice cream?
Yeah, I like ice cream.
Favorite ice cream flavor?
Chocolate.
Why?
It tastes good.
Well, okay, but what I mean is, I've got a friend who hates chocolate, cannot stand chocolate, doesn't like it. But we don't. Our favorite ice cream flavors or our favorite pizza toppings I don't think are usually determined by some kind of rational process.
No, I don't think Spinoza would say that the specific ice cream that you like is determined by a rational process, I think he would say that you like that ice cream is a rational process, that it has a reason for it that is internally justifiable.
A doctor and a biologist could explain why, given your physiology, your DNA, all those material bases of what makes you, that could be an explanation for your preferences. But think of the thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of cells in your body. Even if a biologist could explain somehow why you prefer chocolate to vanilla, that's a different process. That's something different from you liking chocolate.
Again, that kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier about we're kind of whether or not intentionally, we've all got these conceptions of reason from, mostly thinkers way after Spinoza, and I don't really see him working with this same kind of this reason as this kind of what you're getting at. I see it as a much more simple. It's almost like baking in this idea of the determinism and this strong attraction towards causal relations being really important to Spinoza into how the affects function. Because without it, I think the affects can be kind of a more loosey-goosey sort of concept, but it also kind of goes into the message that he's going to be getting into even further with the ethics, where it's hey, why are you going to beat yourself up for some irrational or unreasonable decision that you made? Because it had its causes. It had necessarily was going to be that way, right? And to say that, oh, I did the XYZ thing that is unreasonable or irrational seems to say that you did it without due cause or just cause. And what does that mean in a fully deterministic universe?
Spinoza obviously would have known Plato and Aristotle, and like I said in the chat, for Plato and Aristotle, reason does kind of have a supervisory function. So, right. If you think about the way the soul, you've got reason, and then the spirited feelings and the appetites, and then the planty parts that don't really have an effect in ethics. And, like I said, Aristotle makes it explicit, I think Plato would agree, is that the appetites are not rational in the sense that they don't think. They don't plan. They simply want. They desire. They are just pure wanting and desiring, and they are irrational in the sense that sometimes they want too much or too little. So they're not. That's the only sense in which they're irrational. It's not like you can blame them. They can't think, but then reason has to. You have to rationalize the affects. But Aristotle says as a parent sort of rationalizes their child, that the reason has to control the appetites, and through rehabituation adjusts them, makes them moderate, and so on, the golden mean. And so that's kind of the model I have in my mind of the difference, that reason is capable of thinking and planning and doing these kinds of things, whereas the appetites, they just want. And they can't, at least according to this classical Greek notion, which I think held through probably most of the scholastic period, is that appetites can be rational, but only in the sense that they can be made to want what is reasonable, like the reasonable amount of food, the reasonable amount of sex, the reasonable amount of fear or courage. And so they're rational, but only in that sense. And I don't know to what degree Spinoza's borrowing from that.
So I have a comment that is also kind of a question in the sense that, I think he does have his idea of reason is something kind of like that. Although Christian is definitely right in saying that, these are all kind of idiosyncratic ways of conceiving of reason, and Spinoza's got a kind of his own way of doing it. But so what I think is different from the kind of, I don't really know Aristotle as well, but I know Plato somewhat. He's got this kind of tripartite faculties thing going on. Appetite is which comes from the body's appetites, and that, is desire, and that's completely irrational, and we can actually experience it when we dream, because we have dreams where Oedipus complex comes in. That's literally what he says, and I remember this. It's in book 10 of the Republic. He says, in your dreams, you can do some Oedipal things that shows how exactly irrational desire is, and also why the body is something that is just terrible and needs to be transcended. And then you've got, spirit, and then you've got reason as faculty that kind of, or the intellect that kind of apprehends, truth, capital T. So I think he doesn't want to have that really split, especially hierarchical kind of division there. I think the way I'm at least kind of envisioning this is that he would want to say something probably that I think is more similar to what Nietzsche would say, and that, okay, but reason is just another kind of appetite or desire. It's another kind of way of wanting something. That's like a will to power. So, everybody's kind of motivated by will to power, but in different ways based off, the particular struggle of forces that is being expressed through our body or whatnot. So instead he's saying that so when reason kind of prevails, it's because a certain kind of affectation has prevailed, and that's what enables us to then have something kind of like a supervisory kind of organizational kind of objective grasp on things. And but at the same time, it's not a kind of totally just like transcendent distinct faculty. But so do you think that that's right? Does that sound like what Nietzsche would say or whatnot?
What Spinoza would say, or what?
Yeah, kind of the reason is just another appetite, essentially. So that would be the way that he would counter Plato, right?
I have no clue what Spinoza would say at this point.
Nietzsche.
I'm hoping. What's that?
Nietzsche. So Nietzsche would counter Plato by saying reason is just another desire and appetite, because that's what we have. Okay, the will to power is kind of, it explains this complex of forces where one emerges as dominant, and that's gives us our sense of that's the thing, that's what's going on. So when reason wins, that's just the dominant force in a complex of forces. Okay, so that's what I think is kind of what's going on with Spinoza, except he doesn't use so much the word forces exactly, but pretty close. Yeah. But does that sound right? Does that sound like what Nietzsche would say?
Yeah, I think so. He says the feeling of freedom is the feeling of one drive overcoming all the others. Like a tyrant overcoming the mob. That's the feeling of freedom. And then reason. I'm embarrassed to say I don't have a very clear read, because he says things like thinking is like the resultant of a bunch of internal wills to power competing with one another. And so like reason is almost this kind of epiphenomena that rides on top of these underlying internal forces that are struggling. So he seems clearly, he uses reason, right, all the time, and he's thinking rationally. I don't have a clear idea exactly what reason is for Nietzsche, which I'm embarrassed to admit. But for sure, freedom is the feeling of one drive or internal affect overcoming all the others. That he says explicitly.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, it's 8:19. Wow.
I'm
I
curious.
think we fought valiantly.
All right, Chase, you click that link.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. This has been helpful.
Yeah, that was fun.
I always hate it when people point out places where I don't know stuff. So that's on you this week, Chase. I hate it. Like, I don't know. But you wrote, yeah, I know, but I still don't know.
Well, but this might be a prod.
Yeah, I've got a lot of grading to do too, though. So
Oh, there we go.
But you'll remember. But you'll remember.
We've
And-
gone full circle with the conversation.
yeah.
May will come soon, and you'll have that time to crack open Nietzsche again.
Yeah, maybe so. Nighty night.
Hey, there's supposed to be a huge front coming in, so be careful. The temperature is supposed to drop by a good 30 to 40 degrees, hail, high winds,
Oh, wow.
tornado. Yeah, it's supposed to hit around midnight. So please secure garbage cans and stuff like that, because it's the meteorologists have been fairly consistent in what they're saying about this front.
Wait, a tornado?
Well,
Jeez.
isolated, just because when you have thunderstorm
Oh,
activity,
yeah,
which
yeah.
changes the temperatures in the air, it's not a necessity, but it raises the probability.
Oh, I hope we don't lose power again.
I don't want that.
I see a dog tail. Is that a dog tail?
It was my cat. My
Oh,
cat,
it's-
she's hungry, so she
okay.
sticks her ass in my face and to feed me. I guess she's an example of the affectations or what was the thing you said about Nietzsche? Just the will to just appetite. So
Yeah, mine's chill over there, but okay, we'll see some of you Monday.
Oh, Chase,
Chase.
sorry. If you
Yeah.
want to leave, I just have a really quick, it just popped into my head for a question, but
Yeah.
Can I
I'm
go
not
first?
holding anybody.
Can I go first? Chase, did you
Go.
click that? Did you see the video, the goal?
No, so I haven't watched. I don't know anything.
Okay. Sorry, we'll discuss it next Thursday.
Okay. I'm still hoping that what you said is just you're just fucking with me, and and Arsenal prevail. Hopefully.
All right,
Oh God, no!
I'm just
Look
gonna
at
leave it
your
at that. I'm gonna leave it at
reactions. Oh God. Fuck.
that. Christian's question.
Yeah, just real quick. This shouldn't take too long. I was kind of thinking as we were kind of winding down here. If we think about reason as an affect, less a thing in its its own distinct category and more like a unique expression of an affect, right? That has a particular set of powers. Could we also use this to explain like why certain creatures don't exhibit reason, but also other affects, in the sense that like they aren't as complex through the Spinozan view of complexity of body, representing some kind of complexity of mind, or corresponding to rather some kind of complexity of mind. We could just say, hey, they're not at the level of complexity to experience the affects of love, the same way they're not in the level of complexity to experience the affects of reason.
Yeah. So I think that is the distinction that he wants to make between humans and non-human animals, is that it's one of degree and degree of complexity. And that, I think that makes sense to me, that he would say that, yeah, okay, with that degree of complexity, that additional degree of complexity that is unique to humans, there's something kind of that I don't know if I would personally commit to this idea, but that's what gives us the capacity for reason, is that additional complexity, and it's something that is unique to humans. I mean, he definitely thinks that this is 17th century.
Yeah.
Like there's no possible way that he's thinking other than that. Yeah.
But it also seems to like give him the opportunity to give animals their due, I guess. He could be like, yeah, sure, maybe they can have like basic levels of happiness, like the affect of happiness.
Oh
kind
yeah.
of like
Yeah,
by
I
itself.
definitely think he thinks
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
because
Yeah,
they're
so
they're
they-
not rocks, right? But they're lower than humans, so they're gonna miss things like love, perhaps, or maybe even envy to some extent. They just kind of want instead of envy, and then reason. So I don't know. Sorry, that was just something I came up
Yeah, I think they would have the same natural kind of dipolar inclinations of joy, love, hate, sadness.
okay.
Except I think all the ways that it gets more complex with humans, non-human animals would not have all those complexities.
Okay.
That's the way at least I see it.
Cool. Thank you. That was just something I had for you.
No
real
problem,
quick, so
yeah.
appreciate you. Goodbye,
Well,
everybody.
Okay. Hopefully Arsenal
it's-
will win. Let's see. I'm not looking at Eric's expression. No. Yeah, okay. All right. See y'all. Bye.